Hi, this is Jennifer from Read It Again. Come join me while I read part 2 of Moonsilver from the Unicorn Secret series by Kathleen Duey. Please consider subscribing, and if you enjoyed this book, hit the like button and share this video with all your friends. Hart worked for Ruth every chance she got. At first, Simon complained about cleaning barley by himself. Then, in October, he groused about digging potatoes without her. He was upset having to make his own supper in December and January. By February, Hart finally reminded him loudly of all the pennies she was earning. He frowned and kept complaining. "Are you feeding that mare well enough?" he asked at least once a week. "Of course," Hart said evenly every time he asked. Hart was happier than she had ever been. Tibbs still stared at her, but he left her alone, and every evening when she walked Avamere, she let go of the halter as soon as they were far from town. Avamere loved to gallop, free as wind. Hart loved to watch her. The galloping had slowed somewhat, of course. Avamere was very heavy now, her belly full with her growing foal. Hart felt it moving nearly every time she pressed her palms on Avamere's flank. Ruth said that meant the foal was close. She said it would come to help if she would come to help if Avamere needed her. "When will she drop that foal?" Simon asked every single evening in March. Hart just shrugged. She didn't know. She couldn't know. When Ruth needed to go to the market, Hart was impatient to get back. "Give me the pennies," Simon said every time she got home from Ruth's house. Hart handed them to him. Then he would ask his second question, "Is that all?" Hart had never hidden or kept back even one penny. The question insulted her. "It would be wrong to keep a few pennies," Hart asked Ruth one. "Would it be wrong to keep a few pennies?" Hart asked Ruth one fair morning in May. The healer stopped her work and turned. "Doesn't he let you?" Hart shook her head. "Never. Nary a one." Ruth frowned. She looked out the window toward Simon's shack. "Keep half, but be honest. Tell him. Then hide them as well." "Half?" Hart breathed. "Is that fair?" "Half," Ruth said flatly. "More than fair." She added, "He's gotten dawn to dusk work out of you since he found you." She reached up and took down a wooden box. "Here, bury it outside somewhere safe." "I wish I had parents," Hart heard herself saying. Then she blushed. "You do have parents, of course," Ruth said softly. "It's a matter of finding them." Hart looked down at her hands. Flecks of red mallow leaves were stuck to her nails. "Do you think I ever will?" she asked. Ruth exhaled. "I do. Now help me with the valerian root, will you? I have them soaking in the copper tub." A few days later, Hart told Simon she was keeping half her pennies. He roared, then whined. Then he went silent for a few hours. The next morning he acted as though the argument had never happened. That night, after he was asleep, Hart buried the box beside the corral. One evening, going home, Hart saw someone dodge between two trees on River Road, running back toward town. The sun was low and glaring, but it looked like Tibbs Renner. Hart's skin prickled. What was he doing? Hart ran all the way from Ruth's house to Simon's shack and headed straight for Avamere's corral. The mare whickered as Hart ducked between the crooked rails. "Are you all right?" Hart asked her. "Was Tibbs here? Did he scare you?" The mare nudged Hart, pushing her back gently. She seemed fine. Hart felt herself calming down. "I'm a little late," she apologized to the mare. "We better go or it'll be too dark." Hart slid the rails aside, but for the first time, Avamere wasn't eager to get out. "Did he hurt you?" Hart searched the mare's silky white coat for wounds or lumps from rock bruises. Tibbs was a great aim with a rock. He liked to show off. Avamere turned away, then paced a tight circle, switching her tail. Then she lay down, dropping heavily to her knees. She groaned quietly. Hart caught her breath, scared, but beginning to understand. "Avamere, is your baby coming?" she asked softly. "Are you ready to foal?" Avamere didn't respond to the sound of her name as she usually did. Hart could tell she was listening intently to something else, something inside herself. Hart ran for clean rags and was glad when she saw Simon asleep on his cot. She tiptoed in, then out, carrying her own cot blanket along with the rags. Avamere was groaning. It was a deep sound unlike anything Hart had ever heard. The mare strained, then relaxed, gulping in long breaths. Stars came out overhead one by one. The moon rose and climbed in the sky, full and round. Avamere strained over and over until her white coat was soaked with sweat. Aw. Hart stayed close, draping the blanket over the mare's back so she wouldn't get chilled. "Should I get Ruth?" Hart asked the sky. "Does Avamere need help?" Avamere shook her mane, then lifted her head and nudged at Hart's shoulder. "Do you want me to stay?" Hart pleaded. She was afraid to leave the mare alone. She was just as afraid to wait any longer to run for help. What if Avamere was having trouble? Suddenly Avamere groaned, her whole body trembling with effort. Hart saw two tiny hooves emerge. The next push brought spindly front legs and a muzzle small enough to drink from a teacup. Hart held her breath. Avamere made an odd sound somewhere between pain and joy. She strained again. The foal slid into the world and lay still on the ground. Then it curled like a fish without air. Hart frantically wiped away the birth water from its nostrils and eyes. She soaked one rag and picked up another. The foal wriggled in her arms. Avamere turned to lick at her baby. Hart kept rubbing. Together they dried the foal and helped it stand on its own skinny legs. The foal's coat was purest white. In the moonlight, it looked silvery. "Moonsilver," Hart whispered and smiled. It was the perfect name. The morning after the foal was born, Simon stood by the fence, frowning. "Look at it! It's ugly!" Hart stared at the baby horse that had slept in her arms. "He's only a little small. He'll grow, and—" "Small?" Simon exploded. "It's sickly like its mother." Hart shook her head, moving a step closer to Avamere. "She was half-starved, Simon, and hurt, not sickly." He rubbed his chin. "What's wrong with its face?" Hart bit her lip. The foal's head was oddly formed. It worried her. "Nothing," she said aloud. "Its forehead is misshapen. It's swollen. Maybe it has brain fever." "No," Hart said. "Tonight you should walk them up the road for that old woman to take a look," Simon said. Hart glanced at him. "I will. Tell her I won't pay her a penny." Hart lifted her chin. "I will pay her." Simon flashed her an angry look. "I suppose you can do what you like with your pennies." "He isn't sickly," Hart said as Simon turned away. But all day she was worried. She did her work. She hoed their little garden and swept the house and cleaned the hearth. She went to gather deadwood with Simon for their fire. Walking home with the heavy sacks, Hart walked as fast as Simon would go. The worry knot in her stomach had been tightening all day. Passing Ruth's house, she peered inside. The old woman was there. Good. Once the firewood was stacked, Simon sat in his chair with a sigh. Hart ran for the horses. The dusk was thickening. "Moonsilver isn't sick," Ruth told her. They stood outside her door, the lantern on the garden wall. Hart let out a breath. "Are you sure?" "I am," Ruth said, keeping her eye on Avamere. The mare's ears were back. She kept circling to stand between Ruth and her foal. "His forehead." I see that, Ruth interrupted. It is odd, but look at how quick he is. He seems very strong for a new foal. Hart let out a long breath. Of course, Ruth was right. Just feed Avamere every bit you can manage. The foal will grow strong and straight if her milk is rich. I will, Hart promised. She kept her word. Every day she walked a mile down to the river and back to cut heavy bundles of tender grass. She hunted by moonlight for fallen early plums along Lord Dunraven's fence. She even saved boiled barley or wheat from her own suppers. Avamere had plenty of milk. Moonsilver nursed constantly, but he stayed small and thin. In the warm June evenings, Hart took the horses up to River Road. Avamere galloped as fast as ever. Moonsilver kept up with her. His legs were spindly, but he ran like lightning. As summer nights warmed, Ruth's herbs needed setting. Then they needed weeding, and finally they had to be cut and dried. Hart learned that each plant was different. Some loved damp soil, others rotted in it. Some grew fast in bright sunlight, others died without shade. Some days they gathered wild herbs. Hart loved the long walks into the woods. Meadowsweet and velvety vervain, lobelia and prickly coulter's wort. Hart learned where each herb hid in the forest. And she was learning what they were used for. On market days, Hart usually went to town with Ruth Oakes. But it was different now. Ruth started selling her herbs at one end of the market square. Hart began at the other. They visited every customer's booths, selling everything they had brought and doing it twice as fast. Hart often saw Tibbs Renner. He never spoke to her, but she caught him staring sometimes. In a way, she was glad when she saw him. At least she knew he wasn't out poking around Simon's place, bothering Avamere. Ruth always said hello to Tibbs, but then Ruth said hello to everyone. I saw Tibbs on River Road, Hart told Ruth on the way home after the first market day in July. Where? Up by your place, headed back into town. I was afraid he had done something to Avamere. Ruth looked sad as they walked on. Her silence lasted a long time. Finally, she straightened her apron, jingling the day's coins. Tibbs is mean because his father is mean to him, and the children taunt him. They taunt me too, Hart said. Yes, but his father, Ruth began, then fell silent again. Hart wondered if her own father had been kind or cruel. She tried for the 1,000th time to follow her memories backward. They stopped where they always had. Before that day in the river grass, she had no memories at all. I do wish Simon hadn't sold the blanket, she said quietly. Ruth sighed, understanding her. It was lovely. Silver thread embroidery of unicorns. Unicorns, Hart echoed. Simon had not told her that. Ruth smiled. I saw it. Old-fashioned by 100 years. No one believes any of those old stories now. My parents must have been rich then, Hart said, if they owned a fine old blanket like that. So why would they just leave me? I don't know. Ruth reached out to touch Hart's cheek, but you will find out one day. I am sure. Hart was unable to think of anything to say. She pulled in a deep breath. Tibbs stares at me. He hates me, I think. We'll both watch for Tibbs, Ruth said. Turned down Crooked Lane and headed for her house. If he causes trouble, I'll help. She opened her front door and went inside. Just leave Tin Blackaby out of it. The boy has enough trouble. Hart followed Ruth into the kitchen, thinking, if children stole or set fires or did other terrible things, Tin Blackaby could arrest them. There were prisons in Dunraven's castle. Hart could recall 3 boys being sent away. None had ever come back. I won't tell Tin Blackaby anything, she promised. Thank you, Ruth said. If Tibbs gets his chance, He'll turn out all right." Ruth found her lantern and lit it, then spilled the day's money out onto her kitchen table. Hart added the coins she had collected. Ruth made 2 stacks. One was a little smaller. She pushed it toward Hart. "You've learned a great deal these past months," she said. "We can be partners now." Hart was astonished. "I haven't learned nearly enough." Ruth smiled. "I agree, but you will." Hart stared at the money. If Ruth made her partner, she might someday have enough to buy shoes. And she would save every penny after that, so maybe she could really see Derrytown and Dunraven's castle one day. Hart imagined herself riding Avamere into Derrytown. Moonsilver would run along, loose behind them, strong and beautiful, his hooves dancing on the road. She would wear a new red coat and soft leather boots. People would wonder who she was. "Take it," Ruth said. "You have earned it." Hart stared at the coins, then swept them up and put them into her pockets. "Thank you." The words seemed far too small, so she said them again. "Thank you." Hart's partnership with Ruth meant she was gone all day, every day. She gave Simon some of her money so he didn't scold her. As August passed and September came, he began gleaning the fields. The harvesters had been too quick again. They had been careless. The fields were full of missed grain. Simon came home with a heavy sack every evening, smiling. Then, one evening, Simon met Hart at the door. He was frowning, but said nothing until supper. "Tin Blackaby has called a meeting," he told her. "One of his men pounded at the door today to tell me." Hart looked up from her bowl of boiled wheat. "No one knows what it's about," Simon said in a low voice. "Can't be anything good. His meetings never are." Hart nodded, her stomach tightening. "When?" "Tomorrow evening. You'll have to skip the mare's gallop." Hart nodded and stood, her appetite gone. Simon saw the barley in her dish and reached to pick it up. "That fool mare and that colt," he muttered. Hart didn't answer, but she knew what he was thinking. He was afraid something they had done was the cause of the trouble. Everyone in Ash Grove would be afraid of the same thing tonight. River Road was as full of people as Hart had ever seen it. Everyone was walking slowly, quietly. Simon was silent, frowning. Where River Road met Crosswater Street, they turned toward Market Square with all the rest. "There are hundreds coming," Simon muttered as they slowed with the thickening crowd. "Even the old ones and babies. Blackaby must have sent messengers to every door." Hart looked around as they walked. Simon was right. There were people so old that their grandchildren had to help them walk. She saw Tibbs just as they turned onto Trader's Path. He was with his family. Mr. Renner looked angry. Hart saw Mr. Renner shove at Tibbs, saying something close to his ear. Tibbs looked scared. "Stop staring at them," Simon said, tugging at Hart's sleeve. "I want no arguments with the knacker." Tin Blackaby had his men build a platform at one end of Market Square. He stood upon it, his mouth a thin, angry line. In front of the platform, a row of his men faced the crowd, their arms crossed. The back of the square filled up first. No one wanted to stand near Blackaby's men. Hart and Simon ended up in the middle. People stood close together, but no one spoke. Tin Blackaby stared at them until people began to clear their throats and glance around uneasily. "The harvesters this year were careless," he shouted, finally startling everyone. Hart felt her pulse quicken. Uh-oh. "No one bothered to tell me this," he accused them. "No one told me, so I could not tell Lord Dunraven." Hart noticed a tall figure in a black cloak standing behind Tin Blackaby. Had the man been there all along? "I could not tell our lord that he had been cheated." Tin Blackaby's voice was rough and loud. Hart noticed people drawing even closer together. Everyone looked straight ahead. How many of you noticed that the fields had been harvested poorly these past 2 seasons? Hart waited. No one put up a hand. No one called out. Tin Blackaby muttered something Hart couldn't hear. Then he raised his voice again. "You have all shamed me before Lord Dunraven," he said. "I told him you were honest. I said you would admit a mistake, but I see I was wrong." The tall figure stepped forward suddenly and Tin Blackaby dropped to one knee. He bowed his head. The man in the black cloak pushed back his hood. Hart had never seen Lord Dunraven, but she knew that's who he was. He had long silver hair. Even from where Hart stood, she could tell that he had narrow, angry eyes. And when he spoke, his voice was like thunder. "People of Ash Grove, be grateful that I am honest and fair. Be glad I will not punish you." The crowd stirred as people exchanged nervous glances. No one spoke. "Tomorrow at dawn, men will come to your homes. They will collect my share of the wheat and barley you have gleaned from my fields. Half." Lord Dunraven paused nearly a full minute before he spoke again. "And if you ever cheat me again, I'll make you sorry." He waited another full minute. Then he gestured like a farmer shooing away pesky dogs. "Go home." Hart followed Simon out of the square. No one was talking. Even the smallest children were quiet. Hart scanned the crowd. Where was Ruth Oakes? Maybe she was tending someone too sick to leave. "It isn't fair," someone said clearly. "Shh," an old man hissed. "He's right, though," someone else muttered. No one responded. They trudged back up the hill to River Road. The sun set and dusk darkened the sky. By the time they got to Crooked Lane, it was nearly dark. Only then did Simon speak. "Get a halter on that mare." Hart was startled. "Why?" "As soon as it's pitch dark, you're taking her to the knackers, her and the colt." Hart shook her head. "Why? No one said anything about them." "Maybe Blackaby's man didn't notice them, but Dunraven's man will." Simon made a chopping motion with one hand. "If they go to the knackers tonight, I get paid, and there's no trouble with Dunraven's man come morning." "No," Hart breathed. "You can't ask me to do that." "Why not?" Simon demanded. "I will do it if you won't. That colt isn't worth raising." "I'll give you some of the money, of course," he added, softening his voice. Hart wanted to scream at him. She held it back. She bit her lip. And she nodded. "I'll take them then." "Good girl," Simon said. Then he went inside, slamming the door behind him. Hart put the halter on Avamere. She told Simon she was cold and carried her ragged coat and her blanket outside. She waited 5 minutes. Then she went back in.